Hello, everyone, and welcome to PeaceCon 2024. I am Allison Oakley, and I am Vice President at Pact. I am thrilled to moderate this presentation, Building Cohesive Societies, Comparing and Contrasting Social Cohesion Tools and Strategies Across Contexts. You're going to hear from four wonderful speakers and organizations. Bridget Kimball from Catholic Relief Services. Bridget, just if you could wave for those on the call. Ricardo from Innovations for Poverty Action. Lina Maria Jaramillo Rojas from Pact. And thanks, Lina. And Ted Holmquist from Mercy Corps. To save time, in the chat window, my colleague Caroline Brazil will drop a link to our event page, which has the bios for all of our speakers. So please check it out. Thank you, Caroline. This is going to be a very hands-on learning session. You will learn about how 4 different approaches to operationalizing social cohesion. We're then going to apply learnings in breakout session activities. And we'll close with an overview of the similarities and differences amongst the 4 approaches and how you can apply them in your own work. We really want you to use and improve on what we've done. The presentations will follow the project lifecycle. Ted will start by discussing Mercy Corps' COALESCE approach to designing and implementing a social cohesion program. Bridget will then talk about the MIRA tool designed by Catholic Relief Services to help with social cohesion monitoring and adaptive management. Lina Maria will present Pact's Rumbos Index, which helps with complexity-aware adaptation and formal assessment of social cohesion. And then Ricardo will then present on formal impact evaluation of social cohesion programs and IPA's experience doing so. Then the breakout sessions are designed to help you apply the learnings and also to enable the extroverts and the introverts equally to have virtual fun. So hope you will enjoy that. Then we'll come back together for a brief readout. And lastly, I will close with a few comments on comparing the approaches and moving forward. So before I pass to Ted, let me just note that in the comments box, Caroline is dropping a link to a blog post that summarizes the presentations and includes a number of links for more resources to learn more. It's a one-stop shop for all of our presentations today. So without further ado, I'm going to pass to Ted to lead us off. Thank you so much, Ted.
Yeah, thank you, Allison. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining us today. It's my pleasure to present Mercy Corps' approach to social cohesion, what we call COALESCE. And just getting into that, talking about social cohesion and our approach, you know, when we were starting to outline how we do this work at Mercy Corps, it really started in another area. And that was in the measurement space, as we were looking to better define and measure the concept of social cohesion itself. And this was not an easy task, because there's a huge body of research and evidence on this topic, but there had been a bit of a lack of consensus over competing definitions and indicators for measuring social cohesion. So our research team put together a measurement toolkit for social cohesion and social capital. It was a request from the World Bank to develop this toolkit for their community-driven development operations. And what our team did to put together this toolkit was to review over 70 pieces of empirical research on social cohesion. And our team found that there were over 2,600 survey questions that had been used to try to capture this concept of social cohesion. And so there was no real stable definition or conceptual framework for it. So our team, in order to make sense of all of this evidence, analyzed the existing literature through the lens of different theories of change and multiple social cohesion programs, and looking especially at social cohesion programs that Mercy Corps implemented around the world over the past several decades. And one of the things they did was they spoke to our team members around the world and asked them to describe social cohesion in their own words. And that's what you see on the screen now, the different ways that people try to capture this concept. And one of the common themes that really jumped out was that at its heart, social cohesion was about the ability of communities to collaborate for the common good with one another and with their government and other leaders in their community. So as a result of this analysis and reflection, we came to define social cohesion as a sense of trust, shared purpose, and willingness to engage and cooperate among different individuals, groups, and institutions. And so we put this definition in action by focusing on 6 measurable dimensions: trust, collective action norms, and civic engagement, along with three definite dimensions that collectively make up shared purpose. And those three dimensions were belonging, shared identity, and attitudes towards other groups. And one of the things that came up among these different cluster of dimensions was this idea of social cohesion referring to a social glue that is kind of comes up again and again in a jargon-free definition of the term. So this definition and conceptual framework became the heart of the measurement toolkit that we published with the World Bank in 2020 that took that pile of 2,600 survey questions and put into a concise set of 18 key questions that teams can use. And the toolkit also helps, it provides guidance in terms of how you can adapt those survey questions to any given context or program. And as we were developing this toolkit, we saw, well, this reflection process is really helping us to better define and outline our approach to programming in this space as well. So that toolkit that you see on the left led to our COALESCE handbook that you see on the right. So what is COALESCE? Well, it stands for, the term, we know coalesce is different parts coming together to form a greater whole, but it's also an acronym that stands for collective action and local engagement for social cohesion. And so it draws from that same consultation initially that we used to develop the measurement toolkit, but also a much broader conversation with our teams around the world and looking at the programs we've done. And so this handbook, the COALESCE handbook, is intended both for peace building and good governance practitioners who work specifically on social cohesion, but also for those working in the broader development or humanitarian space who are looking to integrate social cohesion interventions or concepts into their work. And so what COALESCE does, primarily one of the main kind of cornerstones of it, is that it outlines 4 elements to build social cohesion. And it provides implementers with guidance on how to select and combine these elements in any given program. So you wouldn't necessarily do all of these in one program, but you might do different parts of them. And they are, as you can see on the screen, first, to facilitate opportunities for groups to engage in collective action across conflict lines. Second, strengthen peaceful conflict management practice. Third, foster social and cultural engagement. And fourth, facilitate meaningful inclusion of youth, women, and other marginalized groups. And all of these are critical, but I might just zoom in a little bit on 2 of them. The first is strengthening peaceful conflict management practice. Now, sometimes, we in Mercy Corps and our peace building work, we kind of see the 2 pillars of our work as being the social cohesion side and the conflict management side. So conflict management, working on mediation and negotiation and dispute resolution, is a pillar in its own right. But we've also seen how it can really play a really important role in strengthening social cohesion as well. And moving on, from there, we also have 2 key programmatic applications. So we have those elements of social cohesion in different programs, and we apply them in 2 main types of programs across the world. And the first is facilitating joint natural resource management. And this really addresses Mercy Corps' overall global strategy, where we see the twin risks, the most important risks facing the world today really are the effects of conflict and climate change. And this is really at the intersection of those 2. The second application that we use it in a lot of our programs is strengthening dialogue and inclusive planning between communities and governments. So, we know that the breakdown in citizen-state relations and issues of governance are often a core element of instability or grievance that lead to a lack of social cohesion. And that's something that we work on a great deal. So moving forward, just to finish a little bit on the handbook and what it contains, one of the items in there as well that's really intended to guide practitioners is a quick start guide that goes through 5 steps. Define the ultimate goal, conduct an assessment to determine social cohesion dynamics, design the intervention to address those dynamics, adapt, catalyze, which I'll get into for the social cohesion programs, and then design and implement your measurement strategy, which you can use the previous toolkit I mentioned for. But just zooming in on a couple of these, on steps 3 and 4, and obviously the handbook is available online for everyone to see, and you can read more about all of these steps there. But talking about steps 3 and 4, for step 3, again, what we're doing here is we're going back to those different aspects of social cohesion that we want to address. Is it around trust or civic engagement or collective action norms or belonging, and defining that? And then it's really questions around seeing what is feasible for a team to achieve in the amount of time you have and with the amount of resources you have, Have you considered vertical and horizontal cohesion, so that cohesion between individuals in society, but also between individuals and people in leadership positions, but also considering some of the risks in a social cohesion program, and how do you make sure you do no harm? And just lastly, on this fourth step, adapting COALESCE. So COALESCE was a pre-existing approach that Mercy Corps had to community mobilization. And it's really a guide that we have also available online that guides communities through a participatory process of identifying and understanding community issues, developing solutions, and prioritizing what to work through. So I'm not going to go into that entire approach, but it really fits into what we do through COALESCE. And so just to finish, I want to talk to you a little bit about where and how we put this, how we put COALESCE into practice. And so in Nigeria, in our Conquer program, we sought to increase social cohesion between conflicting groups in the Middle Belt by promoting economic cooperation. So through community-led initiatives that included, for example, working on communal gardens or markets or milling facilities. So providing an opportunity for community members to interact, develop trust, and improve relationships. And we saw that community members really did increase that trust between them and reported that they had recognized a lot of the economic benefits of these joint initiatives. Moving on to Myanmar, where obviously there are real challenges and tragedy taking place now, but in the past we had worked there in a program that was seeking to strengthen the capacity of local leaders to prevent violence and promote interfaith tolerance. And we worked with a large number of religious and youth leaders from diverse communities, training them in interest-based mediation and negotiation. And we saw that they were able to successfully resolve several of the disputes that were brought to them. And in conjunction with that, there was an increase in interfaith knowledge and understanding and positive interactions among individuals from different groups. And just the last one is our Peace Pro program in Jordan that was seeking to reduce youth vulnerability to recruitment into violent groups. And it engaged with young people, but also parents, caregivers, community leaders, local authorities, and government. And it was a wide-ranging program, but one of the centerpieces was to establish community hubs to support at-risk youth. And what we saw was that it provided a space for young people, a safe space for them, but also a way for them to get involved in local community activities and feel that they had that agency and they had that constructive role they could play, but also then for wider society and leaders to also recognize that role that young people could play and feel that they could be more included in society and in decision-making, and also thereby strengthening social cohesion. So just heading to my last slide, giving you a preview of the breakout groups we're going to have at the end of this overall session. And in the breakout group that I'll be leading, we're going to try and very quickly design a social cohesion program. So really kind of play around with some of the concepts that I presented to you now and show how they can form the building blocks of putting together a program. So that's it for me. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ted. We'll now turn from program strategy to more of a monitoring and adaptation focus. I'll be sharing today about how CRS has integrated social cohesion into its food security and resilience monitoring, with a particular focus on collective action. When we monitor social cohesion in the context of resilience, we can track social tensions as a stressor alongside physical stressors like hunger or drought, as well as social dynamics that hinder or facilitate recovery and resilience. In this brief presentation, I'll share how CRS defines social cohesion. I'll present CRS's resilience monitoring tool called MIRA, and describe how we integrated a social cohesion perspective into our resilience monitoring for more informed programmatic decision-making. CRS defines social cohesion with an emphasis on the strength, quality, and diversity of relationships at different levels of society. We're interested in the extent to which relationships are based on trust, respect, mutuality, and equal opportunity for the dignity and well-being of every person and the common good of all. The different elements of this definition are captured in CRS's conceptual framework for social cohesion, which includes attention to the sociocultural, political, and economic spheres, as well as horizontal and vertical dimensions. For the horizontal dimension, we are interested in the strength, quality, and diversity of relationships among neighbors and peers. And for the vertical dimension, we're interested in relationships involving hierarchies in society between community members and leaders. Building out these concepts, CRS has developed a range of technical resources for social cohesion, including a social cohesion barometer for context monitoring and a new volume dedicated to meal. a social cohesion indicators bank, and various training materials and learning briefs. Following this session, we'll share the PowerPoint, and the resources will be accessible through the hyperlinks you see on the slide. With that background, I'll turn to the MIRA tool, which stands for the Monthly Interval Resilience Analysis tool. Data is collected from households on a range of food security and resilience measures, including the Household Hunger Score, Dietary Diversity, Reduced Coping Strategies Index, and more. A primary function of MIRA is to show month-to-month food security trends. We can determine seasonal patterns and know when situations are abnormal. MIRA can also capture a near real-time record of the shocks experienced by households. CRS has applied MIRA in a number of countries for food security and resilience monitoring to inform adaptive management and to mobilize advocacy. In this array of food security and resilience data, though, CRS's resilience team found that they were lacking insight into social dynamics that facilitated collective action in the face of different stressors. For instance, in Malawi, MIRA resilience data monitoring detected a zone that was experiencing erosion. Communities that were able to organize and mobilize themselves through collective action achieved improved food security and resilience outcomes in out years compared to communities that were not able to mobilize themselves. And so the social cohesion challenge was to more clearly identify and track the factors of social cohesion that enable communities to be more resilient through collective action. An example of social dynamics hindering improved resilience outcomes is a community that lacks access to water. Water points were constructed, but community maintenance has been inconsistent, and the community still cannot reliably access water, even though the infrastructure is there. Social cohesion data can reveal challenges in, for example, intergroup social divisions or dysfunctional water committees, or maybe people's lack of trust in their leaders. Studying different dimensions of social cohesion for collective action can inform adaptations for more targeted programmatic responses. With all that in mind, the social cohesion module we developed for MIRA is an adapted form of the community capacity scale originally developed by Save the Children and Johns Hopkins to monitor the effectiveness of community groups in the context of nutrition programming. A key feature is the focus on collective action. We're intentionally not looking at social cohesion holistically at the landscape level, but rather at specific elements of social cohesion that can facilitate or hinder community collective action. There are 5 domains. There are 5 domains: social cohesion, here in the sense of mutual trust, participatory and collective efficacy, and leadership that helps foster an enabling environment conducive to collective action. The MIRA social cohesion module consists of a series of questions scored on a 5-point Likert scale. Enumerators read a series of statements, such as the one you see on your screen, and respondents are invited to share if they agree or disagree with each statement. In the past year, we've piloted the social cohesion module of MIRA in the Central African Republic. Data is collected quarterly rather than monthly to meaningfully track the evolution of social dynamics, but to still capture seasonal trends. We've observed lower social cohesion scores during the hunger season, for instance, but at the same time, respondents who are members of a community group of any kind show more stable social cohesion scores than respondents who do not belong to any group. The graphic on top here offers a glimpse of the MIRA online dashboard. With the filters in the left-hand column, it's possible to study data by, for instance, gender or geography or displacement status. The absolute values of the social cohesion scores are not as precise and concrete as, say, a food consumption score. But when you study social cohesion scores over time, as in the graph on the right, then trends emerge. Here we can see a dip in social cohesion scores in February of this year. The value of the social cohesion data comes when it's operationalized to inform programming. For instance, in this bar chart, we see the dip in February's social cohesion scores in the orange bar. By itself, the data don't tell us why the scores declined. It's through interpretation that we can try to discern the reasons. To do that, we triangulate what we know of current events and conditions in the area, and community collaboration is a critical part of that process. In summary, social cohesion helps equip communities to mobilize and work together through collective action when confronted with shocks and stressors. Tracking social cohesion in the context of resilience helps to facilitate more informed programmatic decision-making. And finally, social cohesion scores take on meaning through triangulation with current events and trends over time. That concludes this brief presentation on social cohesion monitoring for resilience. If you join our breakout session, you'll be able to access MIRA and try it out for yourself. With that, I'll hand it over to Lina Maria. Thanks.
Thanks, Bridget. Hello, everyone. Now, I want to share with you how Pact has successfully developed tools to define and assess changes in social cohesion in challenging contexts like migration. Through adapting the concept to this specific reality and involving communities and stakeholders, Pact has redefined its approach. I will introduce Rumbos, a participatory index we created to measure improvements in social cohesion and citizen security while gaining deeper insights into the migration dynamics. Let's talk a little bit about the challenging context we were facing. In 2020, amid the pandemic, Pact implemented a project in Colombia to improve human rights for over 2 million Venezuelan migrants facing xenophobia, limited services, and extreme vulnerability. Meanwhile, host communities were perceiving migration as a threat, as a security threat, often associating it with crime and violence under a restrictive police-focused lenses. Here you can see some of the images of the perception of migration in Colombia, and also you can see some of the human rights vulnerations that migrants were facing. And we have a very strong lack of information about those human rights vulnerations that they were facing when experiencing migration. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. How did we reconceptualize social cohesion then in this challenging context? To address this challenge, we adapted, or let's say migrantized, the concept of social cohesion to better respond to the complexities we were seeing in the context. We aligned this approach with a broader citizen security framework, ensuring that we were tackling the human rights vulnerabilities that migrants were facing. And at the same time, we explored the limitations of the government social inclusion narrative, which they were using as a foundation for future migration policies. We identified key enablers such as trust, access to information, access to justice, community-level conflict resolution, and CSO network capacities as essential elements to strengthening both citizen security and social cohesion.
Strengthening both.
How did we operationalize this concept of social cohesion? We were happy because at the end, we found the elements to associate both concepts, citizen security and social cohesion. But we had the challenge to build a tool to inform project strategy, enable adaptive management, measure change over time. And we also need a tool to measure subnational and national units, work with existing monitoring data, a tool to be understandable to technical teams, and a tool capable of empower and enable stakeholders. So we developed Rumbos. Rumbos is a participatory index that evaluates how improvements in social cohesion and citizen security are connected. It focuses on three key dimensions: community cohesion, governance, and social inclusion. Each of these dimensions has its own variables, and we choose those variables, having into account the ability we get to obtain data from those variables, and also having into account the work that local partners were already doing with Venezuelan migrants and host communities. The index gives us a score between 0 and 1, with 1 representing the ideal level of social cohesion and, by extension, citizen security. Essentially, any progress or setback in one of the dimensions would affect the other dimensions, and that was the core idea behind the tool. Rumbos also help us to standardize different types of data and provide overall scores for each dimension, and also scores at municipality level. We follow 8 key steps to build Rumbos. To develop this index, we ensure the participation of local partners and stakeholders. They helped to adapt concepts and definitions, and they participated in data connection and used the results to guide activities and make decisions at making decision level. This collaborative approach is what makes the tool so effective and relevant for the communities we serve. Some of the data and sources and instruments that we use to get the data were surveys that we applied to public officials and local government entities. We applied also a baseline for host and migrant communities. We developed information ecosystem assessment. We also developed diagnosis about human rights violations, and within the communities, we also map risk factors in the communities. We also apply interviews and focus group to key actors. How did we use the Rumbos index? In the migration context, it was key to embed social cohesion under a human rights approach. This gave citizen security and social cohesion a totally new perspective. That means that we managed to advocate for social cohesion as a key opportunity to improve citizen security through community integration, institutional capacity building, and respect for human rights. We went beyond the traditional idea of social inclusion that focuses mainly on increasing the institutional offer. We also demonstrate that citizen security does not improve only with crime rates are reduced, but when host and migrant communities work together to have better access to information, are more aware of human rights, and work together to transform their environments. As you can see in the next slide, there are some findings that I would like to share with you. During the implementation of the project, we managed to increase social cohesion from 51% to 66% across 11 municipalities. We also strengthened trust between institutions and communities through conflict resolution mechanisms at local level. We also increased human rights awareness, and this led to more community integration process, and we improved national government capacity to use data for migration policy and decision making. One of the application that we successfully did was how we include prevention, protection, and response to human rights violation as part of the social inclusion package narrative. And we also promote the development of behavioral studies to understand xenophobia from the lenses of social cohesion. We also had a very collaborative work with the national government to improve the instruments they already have to measure social inclusion, and they include our variables of social cohesion and community integration. This is one picture of the way that we disseminate and show the results to local authorities and national key actors. They could see information about each one of the dimensions and the scores of each one of the variables for each dimension. They also had specific key messages, and they had the information to orient making decision process and focalize strategies in each one of the municipalities, or if they were working in national plans for social inclusion, they could focalize strategies based on this information. So one of the things that we would like to share with you as main takeaways is that the importance to work on this process, engaging communities and involving communities in the way that we are measuring these concepts and we defining the concepts. Social cohesion must be understood from the perspective of local communities that are working in practice. We also think that it's important to embrace complexity, and measurement methods can adapt to the needs of the project. And we think it's really important to take a gender perspective to measure social cohesion inclusiveness. So thank you very much. I finally just want to make an invitation to be in our breakout session. I know that I have telling you a lot of good, like all the process, the good things about the process, but also it is important to talk together about the tricky parts of the process to designing this index. So let's see in the breakout session what kind of solutions we found for these tricky things we have to deal with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lina. So we've heard from our colleagues about measuring social cohesion, mostly for monitoring, you could argue for process evaluation purposes. Now I want to take you to the impact evaluation scope and thinking through how we can measure social cohesion in those type of studies. Our definition of social cohesion is very similar to what Ted already described. It's a joint definition between the World Bank and Mercy Corps. Why we want to evaluate social cohesion programs? The first thing is that involving the concept of social cohesion in our programming has the strong potential to prevent violence, to promote social norms, to foster more inclusive societies. These are all things that we want to achieve. But how do we know if we're getting to that point? Impact evaluation methodologies allow us to measure the causal impact of a particular program or intervention on different outcomes. In this case, we want to measure social cohesion, for example. So impact evaluations will allow us to measure that causality, will also allow us to disentangle the mechanisms or the drivers that are leading to social cohesion. It's also important to know that while impact evaluations happen in a particular context, if well designed, we can also make some generalizable learning and extrapolate those learnings to other contexts. However, it's challenging to measure social cohesion in impact evaluations, not only from a technical perspective, but also from a logistical or operational one. Most social cohesion programs happen in fragile and conflict-affected settings. This leads to challenges on access and potential harms for human subjects, those participating in the study, and also the research team going out and collecting the data. Also, in these settings, there are some short implementation timelines, and there's lack of research infrastructure. So that's also a challenge in itself. And then when we measure social cohesion, we run surveys or interviews that rely on self-reported answers, which can lead to bias, of course. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I want to show you what we think when we want to measure social cohesion. One point is to think about outcomes. There are different ways, different definitions, but we are following one here as an example of a report by Sonnenfeld and co-authors for 3IE. They identify 5 outcomes, which are trust, sense of belonging, willingness to participate, willingness to help, and acceptance of diversity. You can also think of outcomes that are more about attitudes or behaviors, whether they are intentional or actual behaviors, not you observe someone doing or changing actually how they do things. You can also think about horizontal social cohesion, like ties between individuals or groups, or vertical one, ties between these groups and institutions like government authorities, for instance. And then in our portfolio and in the examples you've seen from our colleagues, there are different types of programs that aim to build social cohesion. We can think about intergroup contact, we can think about dialogue, peace education, media interventions, or reconciliation programming, among others. And how do we measure? How do we go out and collect data that can help us inform how social cohesion could actually be operationalized? You can go to administrative records. However, in many fragile settings and the lack of research infrastructure made these records somehow unreliable. The most common way we've seen in impact evaluation research, at least, is going out and collecting primary data, which is usually done through quantitative surveys. We've also seen observation and non-qualitative data being collected to complement the quantitative data collection as well. The important thing is that this data needs to be comparable and needs to be adapted. The tools need to be adapted to the context. In this slide is just to see in a snapshot the different types of programs IPA has supported in social cohesion. This is just a few of them. you will see that there are different types of interventions, as I mentioned before, and very different types of contexts. When we share the slides with you, you will be able to click on the links and learn a little bit more about how these programs evaluated social cohesion, what outcomes they used, what indicators, and what type of data as well. Now, I would like to just dive a bit deeper into two examples. The first one takes us to Sierra Leone. Researchers evaluated a reconciliation program 10 years after the civil war that brought together perpetrators of violence and victims. And the researchers wanted to measure with a local NGO how levels of trust, participation, willingness to help changed. And they collected data using surveys. In the next slide, you will see indicators that the researchers used I think I was muted by mistake. I hope by mistake. So the researchers measured participation, and you can see here participation in different types of associations or having membership in different types of groups, whether religious, whether school-based, whether women's groups, and so forth. And they also highlighted the role of social networks and asked questions around who do people trusted to try to get a sense of how social cohesion worked in this setting. Next slide, please. The researchers found that the program improved forgiveness, increased trust, and also social capital, from usually the victims of violence towards the perpetrators of violence. However, the program also worsened psychological well-being outcomes. And this is one of the things that why it's important to also evaluate not only social cohesion, but also try to capture other outcomes to see if the programs can have unintended negative consequences. The next sample takes us to Iraq, and the researchers here try to evaluate an intergroup contact using sports. It was set in a community with a large number of displaced Christians by the violence of ISIS, and also an important number of displaced Muslims, again, by the violence of ISIS. And the researcher here used an innovative approach to measure social cohesion. In the next slide, we'll see that she separated on the pitch outcomes versus off the pitch outcomes. And when I say pitch, I think I forgot to mention that the intergroup contact programming was about football or soccer. In one group, there were mixed teams, and in the other group, there was just one religion team, in this case, only Christians. And you will see here their willingness to train with other Muslims, the willingness to vote for a Muslim player for a prize, or the willingness to attend mixed religious event, or to go out and eat in a restaurant in a Muslim neighborhood, as well as some attitudinal indices regarding also their perceptions of Christians towards the Muslim community. And finally, in the next slide, we see that there were impacts on the pitch, but not off the pitch. So there was more tolerance towards Muslim players that Christians were constantly interacting with, but not really changes in the attitudes towards the broader Muslim community. So just to finish, the main considerations are that behaviors are easier to change than attitudes, at least in the short term, and then there are potential negative consequences if we don't craft our programming carefully. If you want to join me in the breakout session, you will we'll go through programs of social cohesion and identifying indicators to measure those in impact evaluation research. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ricardo. All right, everyone. Now is you've learned a lot from 4 organizations. We're now going to break out into 4 breakout. We're going to break out into 4 breakout sessions. Sorry for the repetition. And you should be able to self-select into the one that you're most interested in joining for today. we're only going to have one session across the 4 organizations. So if you were hoping to hear more about the other ones, don't worry, we'll have a readout after from all groups. So the 4 groups are the following. The room numbers are aligned with what you see on the slide currently. In room 1 will be led by Mercy Corps, and in that room you'll be able to design sort of speed design a social cohesion program using the COALESCE framework. In room 2, Catholic Relief Services will lead a session on showing you how to monitor a social cohesion program using the MIRA tool. I think they're going to have a data hunt during that session. In room 3, led by Pact, you're going to problem solve through some real life challenges when you're trying to operationalize an index, both operationalizing the design in a participatory fashion, but also what happens when your data are not quite what you want. And then you'll learn about the actual real life solution the project took to solve that. And then room 4, Innovations for Poverty Action, will lead a session activity on how to pair outcomes and indicators to measure social cohesion. So 4 very different ones. Take a moment to absorb the 4 different topics. And then in a moment, our AFP colleagues will open up the rooms and you will be able to self-select into those. We will have 15 minutes from start to end, so we will time it, and then we'll come back here and we'll have a readout and then a time for a live Q&A session before closing. So Yana, if you wouldn't mind starting a 15-minute breakout session and inviting people to join, that would be wonderful.
All right. So you should be able to join the breakout rooms now, and we will meet in 15 minutes in the main room.
Let's see, are we all back, Yana?
Yes, everyone is back in the main room. Great.
I don't know about you, but that flew by for me, which always happens with breakout sessions. That being said, I hope you had a good activity. So that because we couldn't all join all sessions at this time, we're asking everyone to do a quick readout of 1 minute only from their breakout session, and then we'll do a live Q&A with the presenters. So let's just go by group number, room number. So if we could start with Mercy Corps, if you the floor is yours for a 1 minute readout.
Yes, thank you. And so what we did in our group was the very super quick design of a program. I mean, really it was just a way to play around with some of the concepts we presented in COALESCE. And what the colleagues presented, it was interesting. We started looking at the dimensions of social cohesion, you know, trust, belonging, collective action, norms, civic engagement. And we really focused more initially on some of those elements around identity questions and people's attitude towards out groups and their sense of belonging in their group and the trust of the other group, which seemed to be central at the start, but you know, was highlighted how these are all interconnected. Of course, it's sounding kind of a little simplistic now in a 1 minute readout, but there was a good depth to that conversation. And then lastly, putting it all together, what I think was most interesting, worth flagging, was that we were looking at what are the different elements of the program, the different kinds of programming you would want to do. And one of our colleagues presented working on youth, including marginalized groups and including women and youth. And we talked about the linkage and how is that connected to these wider issues of trust and belonging and identity. And it was this idea that within a group, you need to have that sense of inclusion, that everyone can be a part of the conversation, that people can be involved in decision-making in order to then be able to look at that more broadly in a society. Wish I could tell you more, but I think that's probably just about a minute recap there. Thanks.
Thanks for that. I think next up is the CRS group, group 2.
Yeah, Austin will share for us.
Okay, thanks, Bridget. Yeah, so it was a small group. It was Bridget, myself, and then Raju Bhatt from Kashmir University. So we had an interesting conversation about technology and the role of AI and virtual reality potentially. But then we dug into the MIRA dashboard and evidence from the Central African Republic pilot and looked at how the different dimensions of social cohesion were measured, how we explored different trends and how different trends could potentially lend themselves to adaptive management or specific training about dimensions of social cohesion that were potentially weaker or stronger if there were things we wanted to emphasize. And the importance of kind of keeping track of things as they move through the course of the year so that when conditions start to worsen, we can address them before conditions really get to the point where it's affecting people's well-being. So we didn't get too far into it. It was a short session. The dashboard is dense, but there's a link I can share for people who weren't in our breakout session who would like to explore the data we've collected from CAR and how the tool and the dashboard works. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Very interesting. Passing to the group 3, the Pact group.
Oh, nice to be with you. I'll do our report out really quickly. I'm Caroline Brazil. I work on Pact's governance team. As Lena noted, the session itself kind of dug into some of the challenges of designing and kind of advancing the Rumbos index. So there were 3 scenarios that Lena created, one around the degree of kind of inclusivity of some of the kind of information being fed into the index, what to do when there's kind of disagreement about alignment about that dimension. One about the kind of weighting of how different data are kind of weighted throughout the process and monitored over time. And then the last one was around just data sources, kind of what to do when there's a lack of open source information available, how that affects how the kind of index is applied and how change is kind of understood over time. So we use the Mentimeter tool as well to understand, what are some of the kind of troubleshooting measures that people in the group were interested in kind of learning to solve the problem in front of them. And then ultimately, Lena also shared with us which of those available options the Rumbos kind of index and the team in Colombia decided to apply. I thought the conversation was really interesting, and also right as we were running out of time and needing to get back to the main room, Allison, the question you asked around this balance of how do you balance all of the needs from technical teams who are really interested for the data with these kind of needs and realities around needing to refine the kind of data and design of the index itself. So this kind of reality around the relevance of iterative design and participatory approaches and how we can kind of get creative about how those are kind of carefully integrated over the course of an entire project was really interesting as well. So huge thanks, Lena. Thanks all.
Thanks, Caroline. And the IPA group 4, who is leading that one?
I'll represent the group here. And we ran out of time, unfortunately, but we started the conversation thinking about how to measure, or the importance of measuring violence in social cohesion programming, in addition to the outcomes we were discussing in the presentations, like trust or sense of belonging, for instance. Then we moved into a MIRA board to have a more interactive discussion about how to create indicators. So we used an example from one of the participants of a reconciliation program in Somalia that used community-level dialogue. And when we were starting to think about outcomes and indicators, we ran out of time, unfortunately. But just to address one of the quick questions I had is the participants were interested in measuring willingness to participate, and we conceptualized that as an outcome. And then there was a little bit of confusion. What's the difference between outcomes and indicators? And so just broadly speaking, outcome will be more about the concept that you try to measure. Indicator will be something more tangible that you build with the data. I'm happy to continue the conversation with the group and others here. So I think, Alison, you will share emails, so feel free to send me a note.
Yes, thanks all. Super interesting. And I think we should probably have more time at some future event to go into these activities in detail, because I think they were super fun and well thought through for the learning aspect. So thank you all for that. And thanks for those who did the summary. We have a few minutes for some live Q&A before we sort of wrap up. There were a couple questions in the chat that were already identified. So I'm going to draw our attention to those. And the first is from Thomas Donnelly with a follow-up from Susanna Zietz. I apologize for butchering your name. And Bridget Kimball has a very good response in the chat. I also was hoping that Ted and Lena could weigh in, because there are questions around the applicability of social cohesion in a humanitarian context, but also in a closing civic space. Or I guess the term here is obstructive civic space. I know Ted mentioned the humanitarian context of Myanmar. I know that Lena's Rumbos index was in a closing civic space in Colombia. So I was hoping you two could say a few words, in addition to if participants could review what Bridget wrote in the chat as well. So not to put you on the spot, Ted and Lena, but if you could share some wisdom, we would love it.
Sure, I could try. I'll just jump right in quickly. Yeah, on the question around working in the humanitarian space, at Mercy Corps, we have another approach called Advancing Peace in Complex Crises, which really looks at this. And I mean, to describe it briefly, it takes the starting point as conflict sensitivity. in terms of how we can operate in some of these challenging contexts, and then brings it all the way around to kind of the wider humanitarian development peace nexus. But what I would say is just a relevant aspect here is how even in these humanitarian contexts, what we find is that there is that social cohesion that does exist. And I think you can see it, that it often, you know, some of the first and most effective responders are in the communities themselves, those who host refugees, for example, despite not having many means of their own in many cases. So that social cohesion element is there. And so the question becomes how you can strengthen it. So I think it is applicable in those cases without going into all the details about them. But I think it's certainly something that that can be done and needs to be done. Over.
Yes, I will add what Ted said, that it's not just possible, but desirable to apply these kind of tools in those specific contexts, because the tool can give us information about the strategies and what kind of things we can prioritize, for example, in order to open the civil space. For example, in the case of Rumbos, one of the things that we've prioritized and focalized, because migrants, I mean, they didn't have access to services, nor even have access to rights. So civic space was pretty obstructed. But we found that communications through community was important for them to access to information, and they were more aware about human rights and about the services that they were right to access, even when they were in a foreign country. So it was important for them to build networks around that information. So communication through communities was really important, and also the tool helped us to identify that providing legal assistance was like a window of opportunity to inform people about their human rights and make them more aware of the importance of observance of human rights in that specific context. So I think it's desirable to apply those kind of tools in those contexts.
Thanks, Lena. Thanks, Ted. And the next question is also from Susanna, and it's around, am I muted? Am I good? Okay. I had that moment of panic. A question around using some of our approaches or adapting them to different contexts. And I know certainly we all the panelists have, but I was hoping that Ricardo from the impact evaluation perspective and Bridget from the monitoring context, if you could speak a few words around when you adapted or used your approaches in different contexts, how that differed, how is it similar, and any sort of challenges or best practices therein. So maybe if we could, Ricardo, if I could put you on the spot, if you could answer first.
Certainly. In my experience, each impact evaluation study has to be carefully adapted to the particular context. So usually the way social cohesion is measured, the outcomes used to try to assess social cohesion are different from one study to the other. I haven't seen, I think it will be great for the research community to try to standardize some measures, and maybe we can think about adapting Rumbos or MIRA or COALESCE to have a more standardized approach that can also be comparable across contexts. Right now, what I've seen is that we are measuring trust or willingness to participate, reduction of prejudice, with very different sets of questions that might not be that comparable across context always. So that's a challenge I've seen so far.
Thanks, Ricardo. Bridget, if you could jump in.
Sure. And to add to what Ricardo said, it is important to contextualize the tools, the research questions to the specific needs of that context, as well as the constraints. One challenge in adapting the tools too much isn't that the scales are built in, they've been validated, and if we start changing some of the questions in these tools, then we have to revalidate the overall tool. That is one challenge. Something that we did recently in Central America, we were working in a context where it wasn't possible to say that we were doing social cohesion work. It became a politicized term, and we were working with farmers groups, and the civic space was very limited. What we did in that case was to call the work that we were working for a healthy environment, a healthy and agricultural environment. And in that way, we avoided loaded politicized language. And then we were able to continue with the essential work of bringing people together for shared livelihoods. So those are a couple of observations. Thanks.
Thanks, Bridget. And there's one last question from Raju before we'll close, and it's about polarization in social media. I think I'm interpreting it correctly, but I was hoping, Lena, you worked in a very polarized political context. If you could say a bit about how the polarization affected your approach to social cohesion, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. From our experience with Rumbos in the migration context, we had to tackle xenophobia because xenophobia was like a consequence of polarization and disinformation. So when the tool starts showing the need to include a component and an element about access for information, we start thinking with the local partners to prioritize communication within the communities. So they start tackle this information, showing their own communities what information was fake about migrants, what sources were untrustful about the information they were spread about migration. And after doing that, we also promote like behavioral studies and behavioral exercises to understand a little bit the biases related to xenophobia and discrimination behaviors in the immediate surroundings of migrants and host communities. So it was because we add that specific element into the dimensions that we measure with the tool that we were able to prioritize those kind of actions.
Thank you, Lena. All right, we're just about at time, so I'm just going to wrap us up. Can you see my screen okay? Am I good?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you. So we wanted to end by just, we threw 4 approaches and challenges at you. Wanted to find some commonality across them. So I'm sort of outlining commonalities and differences in two categories. One is how the different organizations understand social cohesion and their different approaches to applying social cohesion approaches in their programming. So you will have noticed that all 4 groups had very similar definitions of social cohesion. Nevertheless, each operationalized them in very different ways to ensure that the programming had a practical application for social cohesion. They didn't want to just have it this very complex concept. They wanted to make it very concrete. And yet by making it concrete, by concretizing the social cohesion concept, they still kept the complexity of it without sort of reducing it to very sort of specific indicators. They wanted to make it operationally useful, but also embrace the complexity. So I found that very useful interesting across the 4 organizations, and you will certainly see that if you look at the resources that we've shared. And then lastly, using the different approaches. So each of the approaches we talked about today focus on different life cycle phase, project life cycle phase. So design, implementation, adaptive management, assessment, and evaluation. But these phases, as you know, are not mutually exclusive. A design aspect will help with your evaluation and vice versa. So we definitely encourage you to take what these 4 groups have done and adapt their approaches to whatever phase or need that you have. And of course, underlying concepts and indicators are useful across all phases, not just a single one. So we are at time, so we wanted to thank you ever so much for joining us today. Thanks Alliance for Peacebuilding for the conference and the support for our work. We hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Caroline will drop in the resource links again for you. We will update them, and please reach out to the panelists for any questions you have about their presentations. And I thank you again. Have a wonderful rest of the conference.